It's crazy that James Reese Europe isn't more of a household name. A pivotal force who changed the course of music history, he was a World War I hero who brought jazz to the world. Before James Reese Europe, Black music was an often stereotyped folk idiom. After James Reese Europe, Black music was American music. James Reese Europe was born in Mobile, Alabama in 1880 or 1881. His father was a church pastor who was born a slave. His mother was a teacher who was born free. They were both musicians, and young Jim learned piano, violin, banjo, and mandolin from them. At the age of 10, his dad got a job at the National Post Office, and the family moved to Washington, D.C., where his mom made the entire family take formal music lessons. Europe studied violin with Joseph Douglas, grandson of Frederick Douglass, who incidentally was himself a violinist. Jim followed his brother to New York City in 1902 and discovered that there was very little demand for a classical violinist. The city was in the middle of ragtime fever, and ragtime was piano music. Jim made the switch, and he was soon one of the leading musicians in the Tenderloin district. At the turn of the 20th century, the Tenderloin was the predominant red light and entertainment district of New York City. This was where Tin Pan Alley was, along with pretty much all of the theaters, bars, brothels, dance halls, and clip joints in the city. The Tenderloin was also the predominant Black neighborhood of New York at the time. From 1903 to 1905, the city cleared 4 blocks in the Tenderloin to build the original Penn Station. Several Black-owned buildings were either bought out or condemned. That's when Black residents moved uptown to San Juan Hill and Harlem. What we now call the Harlem Renaissance started off in the Tenderloin and moved uptown. Europe found steady work as a member of a vaudeville orchestra called the Memphis Students. He was also hired as musical director for several Black vaudeville productions. In 1908, he was invited to be part of the Frogs, an elite club of Black entertainers started by the biggest Black stars of the time, George Walker and Bert Williams. This organization might have given Europe the idea to create the Clef Club, a labor union and booking agency for Black musicians that was incorporated in 1910. At its height, the Clef Club negotiated fair pay and decent working conditions for 200 members. Europe and his Clef Club musicians began playing at posh parties held by the Astors, the Vanderbilts, and the Carnegies, but this wasn't enough for Europe. He gathered together an enormous ragtime orchestra of Clef Club musicians to play at the Manhattan Casino, a gigantic Black concert hall. This event was so popular that Europe was invited to bring the Clef Club Orchestra to Carnegie Hall. Europe pulled out the stops for the Carnegie Hall gig, assembling 125 Black men and 10 pianos to play Black music in one of the most prestigious white concert halls in the world. Let me just note that in 1912, when James Reese Europe played Carnegie Hall, many Black artists believed that the only way towards advancement was to adopt European culture, i.e., classical music and opera. James Reese Europe stood in direct opposition. He believed that Black music could be taken as seriously as white music. As he said, "We colored people have our own music that is part of us. It is the product of our souls. It has been created by the sufferings and miseries of our race." Meanwhile, Vernon and Irene Castle have become a sensation in Paris for their wholesome interpretation of the grizzly bear, the bunny hug, and other animal dances. In 1913, the Castles were invited to perform at Mrs. Stuyvesant Fish's party, the most exclusive event of the Newport summer season. Of course, Mrs. Fish also hired the leading dance band. The Castles went wild over James Reese Europe's music. By the end of the night, Vernon Castle had hired James Reese Europe to be their exclusive musical director. Vernon Castle and James Reese Europe were both one-man marketing machines, and their collaboration was extremely fruitful. Because the Castles had an exclusive agreement with Victor Records, James Reese Europe and his orchestra became the first Black musicians with a recording contract. They recorded 7 songs for Victor Records in 1913 and 1914. Get a load of Buddy Gilmore and his amazing drum solo at the end of the Castle Rag. Europe composed and published 11 dance songs for the Castles. Then he assembled an 18-member band to accompany them on a 30-city tour. They went as far north as Toronto, as far west as Omaha, and as far south as Washington, D.C. Europe and his orchestra performed on stage, not in the pit, and the site of the 2 golden stars of social dance, surrounded by 19 upstanding Black men, astonished audiences. The Great War brought this collaboration to a screeching halt. In 1915, Vernon Castle joined the Royal Flying Corps. After surviving 100 missions and being decorated with the Croix de Guerre, he was killed in a training exercise in 1918. He was just 30 years old. Black civic leaders had been lobbying for years for the formation of an all-Black National Guard regiment, in the belief that Black people in the military would lead to greater civil rights. In 1916, with Pancho Villa attacking the Mexican border and America's imminent entry into the Great War, the governor of New York finally relented. Colonel William Haywood, a lawyer and veteran of the Spanish-American War, was appointed commander and ordered to assemble New York's 15th National Guard Regiment. Haywood convinced his friend Europe to join as second lieutenant, with the master plan of using Europe's celebrity to coax more Black men to sign up. Haywood also tasked Europe with the formation of the greatest military band in the world and raised $10,000 to pay the band and support Europe on a recruiting mission. Europe got his bestie, pianist and singer Noble Sisal, to join. And then he went all the way down to Puerto Rico to find more Black musicians who could read music. After a few whirlwind days of auditioning, he chose 18 Afro-Puerto Ricans to be part of his 44-member military band. In August 1917, the U.S. declared war on Germany, and the National Guards were activated for federal service. All of the National Guard units were lumped together as the 42nd Regiment or the Rainbow Division because the units stretched across the country like a rainbow. The 15th was not invited to be part of this regiment because the U.S. Army was still segregated. Instead, they were redesignated the 369th Regiment and sent down to South Carolina to begin combat training. Not a good idea. After a shop refused to sell newspaper to Noble Sisal, the entire town nearly erupted in riots. The 369th was hastily sent back to Long Island for training. In November, the Rainbow Division was deployed to Europe. When Haywood requested that the 369th join in the farewell parade, he was told, "Black is not a color of the rainbow." The 369th soon followed the rest of the National Guard to Europe and landed in France on New Year's Day, 1918. They were assigned to digging trenches, cleaning latrines, and other menial tasks, despite their combat training. Colonel Haywood lobbied for his troops to fight. Since black soldiers could not fight in the segregated U.S. Army, General Pershing sent them on a tour to perform for French, American, and British troops, as well as French civilians. For a month, they marched through 25 towns, covering 2,000 miles. Everywhere they went, people went nuts. Noble Seysel said, "Colonel Haywood has brought his band over here and started ragtime Midas in France." By then, the French army had been fighting for 3 years, and they were exhausted. They were clamoring for American troops to replace them. The 369th couldn't fight in the U.S. Army because of segregation, but they could fight for the French. Colonel Haywood wrote to a friend, "Our great American general simply put the black orphan in a basket, set it on the doorstep of the French, pulled the bell, and went away." On March 14, 1918, the 369th became the first American troops to enter combat trenches, fighting under the French. They quickly became heroes after Private Henry Johnson, a 5'4" train porter, somehow managed to single-handedly repulse 24 Germans with nothing but a rifle butt and a bolo knife. Now nicknamed the Harlem Hellfighters, they spent 191 days in the trenches, more than any other American troops. That's 6 months of trench warfare. They also suffered 1,500 casualties, more than any other American troops. They emerged from the war as heroes, and the entire company was decorated with a croix de guerre. When the Harlem Hellfighters returned to New York City in 1919, they got the parade that they were denied 2 years previously. Unlike most parades that marched down Fifth Avenue, the Hellfighters marched uptown, towards Harlem. 1 million New Yorkers came out to wave and cheer. 19-year-old Private Melville T. Miller later remembered it as the most wonderful day of my life, the day we marched up Fifth Avenue. That's one day that there wasn't the slightest bit of prejudice in New York City that day. In France, Europe had scored another recording contract, this time with Pathé Records. After the Hellfighters landed in New York, they were hustled into the recording studio. Then they embarked on a 10-week tour through Chicago, Philadelphia, and Boston. The plan after that was a worldwide tour, first England and then Europe. Alas, it was not to be. On May 9th, 1919, Europe and the band arrived in Boston for their last 3 shows. At intermission, Europe had a few words with the drummer, Herbert Wright. Out of nowhere, Wright pulls out a penknife and stabs Europe in the neck. The wound seemed to be minor, but the bleeding wouldn't stop. Europe said to Seysel, "I'm going to the hospital and I will have my wound dressed and I will be at the Common in the morning in time to conduct the band." It turned out that the penknife had severed Europe's jugular artery, and the hospital couldn't stem the bleeding either. Seysel, U.B. Blake, and a few other band members showed up at the hospital after the performance. At first, they were told that Europe might need a transfusion. A few minutes later, they were told that Europe was dead. 3 months after their victorious march up Fifth Avenue, the Hellfighters reassembled for another parade. Only this time, they marched silently behind Europe's coffin through Harlem. It was the first public memorial for a black person in New York City's history. After a service on 53rd Street at the St. Mark's Methodist Church, Europe's body was brought to Washington, D.C., where he was buried at Arlington Cemetery with full honors. This is Viva Lamore.
Come jazzers, gather round, jazz lovers from every town. I've got something that I'd like to introduce you to. It's new.